Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Good morning, church. As you can see, our scripture this morning is Genesis 16, 1 through 13. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to do what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my maidservant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your maidservant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, maidservant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I am running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." May God add his blessing to this reading of his word and our hearing of his word.
Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. Do you guys know that song? I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. I learned that song when I was a kid in VBS, and if this was a normal time and I could just have us join in, I'd have us all join in singing, right arm and left arm just pumping away. I learned that song as a kid. I had no idea what it meant. Who is this Father Abraham, and what it mean that I am one of his children, right? And I don't know if any of you have ever kind of asked that question. What does it mean to be a descendant of Abraham? And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we started last week and kind of going for the next few weeks, is we just want to spend some time talking about the story of Abraham. And through the story of Abraham, really kind of coming to understand the nature of promises and the nature of faith. And what does it mean to be people of the promise? People who believe in God's promise and people who receive the promises which were given thousands of years before to specific people in history. Abraham's story, becomes the foundation for the nation of Israel and really the whole Bible. You find kind of, 2,000 years later, reflection upon Abraham in the letter to the Hebrews. The author of that letter in the 11th chapter spends kind of the whole 11th chapter kind of recounting all the heroes of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew scriptures. And he gives the most time, sets aside the most time for Abraham. And he says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to a place he would later receive his inheritance, he obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. And by faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. By faith, Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a promise. By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. That's the way Abraham's story gets told and remembered by the time we get to the New Testament. But it's interesting when you go back and you read the Old Testament story, even though Abraham is held up as this pillar of faith, there are lots of examples and times where his faith is very fragile and fallible. I mean, one of the examples is on two separate occasions, not once, but twice. He pretends Sarah is his sister instead of his wife. He's living in a foreign land. At first it's the Egyptians, the second time it's among the Hittites. But he feels vulnerable and threatened in that place because he's worried that the people around him are going to see Sarah's beauty and they're going to kill him in order to take Sarah as their wife. And so he decides the safer path isn't to just trust in God's protection, which is what God had promised. He doesn't choose the faithful option of trusting in God. Instead, he chooses the option of pretending that Sarah is his sister, because he says, well, they won't kill the brother. In fact, they'll treat the brother with honor as a way of kind of getting to the sister. So he lies and gives Sarah away to be first the Pharaoh's and then the king of the Hittites' wife. Now, even though they are unfaithful to God's promise, God still keeps his promise to them. God's promise is, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you. And so the Pharaoh's household, and then later on the king of the Hittites' household, they endure cursing. And eventually they figure out it's all because of this woman, Sarah, who is not, in fact, a free woman, but is, in fact, married to this man, Abraham. And so they restore Sarah to Abraham, and along the way go ahead and make gifts to Abraham and Sarah as a way of making peace. So God is faithful to his promise, even when Abraham is not. But of all the examples I think that you can go to in the Old Testament where it looks like Abraham is falling in his faith, to me there's no lower moment than the story that Ken read for us today, the story of Hagar. And ironically, it all kind of goes back to that VBS song, Father Abraham had many sons. That's the issue. At this moment in time, Abraham does not have many sons. He doesn't have a single one. At this point, he's been following God for about 12 years, ever since he first received God's call. And he's left his home. He's traveled down to Egypt, gone through that whole saga with the Pharaoh, and moved back up to Canaan. I mean, he's been blessed and enriched and protected, and God has repeated to him multiple times the promise, I will give you land, I will give you children. Your descendants will number like the sands of the earth. Your descendants are going to be more than the stars in the heavens. And yet the promise has not been delivered. He still has no son. And Sarah, for her part, is convinced that she's barren. That if this promise is going to be fulfilled, it will not be through her. And so she has a plan. She has a maidservant. Some translations read slave. And this is an Egyptian woman named Hagar. She was probably part of the gift that Pharaoh gave to Abraham and Sarah when way back to make peace. And so she has this maidservant named Hagar, and she thinks to herself, well, I can give her to my husband, and it says, perhaps I can build a family through her. Now this is, if you ever watched The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, this is what this is about. Like that someone's going to build a family through someone else. And I know we have to kind of get rid of our modern sensibilities around this to some degree, because what Abraham and Sarah are doing here is not unlawful. It was common in that day and age for men to have multiple wives, and that's the idea is that Abraham marries Hagar, so he has multiple wives. That was kind of standard in that day and age. It wasn't unlawful, but we have to note, we just have to note, given our place in history, when we kind of our own legacy and our struggles with racism and our struggles with our founding fathers, we have to recognize that in this moment, Hagar has no agency. She has no choice. Her dreams, her wishes, her aspirations aren't taken into account. She is a means to an end to build the family through her. And even though what Abraham does is not unlawful, it is a moment of broken faith with God, because instead of waiting and trusting for God to fulfill God's promises in God's time, he decides to take matters into his own hands. And whenever we take matters into our own hands to force the promises of God, that never seems to work out very well. And so Abraham marries Hagar. And on the surface of it, the plan works. In short time, she is pregnant. And so, yay, promise fulfilled, except that's not the way it happens at all. In fact, once she becomes pregnant, the issue gets worse and worse and worse, because Sarah then is jealous. And you have to kind of think about it from Sarah's perspective. Hagar was her maidservant, was her slave, and now not only is she a fellow wife, kind of equal standing, but she's even elevated perhaps because she can bear the child that Sarah has not been able to. And she feels this contempt from Hagar. She feels like she's being looked down upon. And so she goes to Abram and she says, "You are responsible for the wrong which I am suffering. I put my servant into your arms," and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. She looks down on me. She has forgotten her place. May the Lord judge between you and me. And Abraham is caught in the middle between these two women. This is why I think polygamy was such a terrible idea to begin with. Like, he is caught in the middle between these two women. And if you've ever been caught in the middle between two members of your family, you know what that feels like, to feel like I can't make everyone happy here. And so Abraham chooses a side, and he says to Sarah, "I'm with you. Your servant, your slave is in your hands." Now, just that sentence alone is so damning that Abraham doesn't say, "My wife is in your hands." It shows how much of a sham their marriage was to begin with. It is the first sign of conflict. He breaks his covenant with Hagar and says, "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you want." And without his protection, Hagar is in an incredibly vulnerable position. Sarah mistreats her. She recognizes this is untenable, that she cannot stay, and she runs out into the desert. And she is all alone, nowhere to go. Now let's just pause the story at this moment. And if you only look at this moment in time, what do you see? You see that Sarah is vengeful. She is taking out on someone else her pain of not being able to have a child. She's taking it out on her, even though she put that person in the position to have the child that she couldn't bear, right? Abraham, what do you say about Abraham in this moment? Abraham's weak. He is completely passive. He doesn't step up and protect, Hagar. He doesn't really fight for justice. He just kind of sits back and lets things unfold. And Hagar, she is completely alone. She's not without sin. She does despise Sarah, but she is definitely the most sinned against. Shortly after my wife and I were married, we moved to Haiti and lived there for a few years. And I remember when we went down to live in Haiti, I had this picture of what the Haitian people were going to be like and what it would be like to serve them. And I was surprised or disappointed when I got down there and discovered that there were jerks, Down in Haiti, there were people who would take advantage of my offer to help. There were people who would be completely ungrateful. And I struggled with this. And I came back, Jamie, I remember 6 months in, we returned home and we met with Dr. Peter Story, who was a mentor of ours, one of the professors who kind of inspired us to go do mission work to begin with. And I was processing this with him and saying, I always thought it would be like this, but it's not like this. And he said to me, try this on. He said, we serve the least of these, not because they are sinless, but because they are the most sinned against. Hagar, in this moment, is the most sinned against. She bears the brunt of all the broken promises. Last week we talked about promises. And I made the case for why promises are so important, that they are vital, that they do three things, that they create identity, and they forge and hold together community, and they shape and determine our future. And I talked about how everything from families to governments to churches, everything holds together based on the fragile thread of a promise made and a promise kept. But today we consider what happens when that fragile thread is broken. What happens when our identity is destroyed by a broken promise? What happens when our community, it comes apart because of a broken promise? What happens when our future is unclear, like it was unclear for Hagar in that moment? I mean, some of you have known the pain of a broken promise. You depended on someone for something, and they didn't come through. They broke their word, and it hurts. Some of us know the pain of being the one to break our word, that even though we set out with the best of intentions, we ended up hurting someone else because they depended on us and we didn't deliver. And we know that shame and that regret. I mean, if this is the end result of promises, just a legacy of heartache and hurt, why do we make promises even to begin with? Wouldn't we be better without them? But here's what I want you to see. Here's what I want you to remember. That this is just a moment in the context of a large story. That when we tell the story of Abraham, how do we tell it? Not as, a failure, not as someone who is weak, but again, we affirm over and over and over again his faith, because over the long course of his story, he was a faithful man. And this is, I hope, perhaps the good news I want to share with all of us, that none of us are defined by our worst moments, but rather the story encompasses both good and bad, both highs and lows. And it's the promises of God that keep the story moving forward. So let's see how this story plays itself out. Like, this is the low moment, but what happens next is an angel comes to Hagar, sent by God, and he asks her, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? It's interesting, Hagar can only answer the first question. She can say, I've come from my mistress, I'm running away, but she can't answer where she's going. And so the angel tells her, go back. Go to the next slide if you don't mind. He said, so the angel told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Now this is what I want you to see. When God first called Abram, which we talked about last week, there was both a command, go, leave your father, your mother, your household, go to the land I will show you. And then a promise, 5 statements of I will do this, I will do this, I will do this, I will do this. Hagar receives the same form. A commandment, go back, followed by a promise, I will. And in Hagar's case, the promise is, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. It's almost the same promise that God has given Abram again and again and again. So Hagar, secured by that promise, does return back to her mistress. And it is not easy. I don't know what it was like for for Hagar to live kind of back after that broken fellowship. But she returns and she stays for another 12 years until Isaac is born. And then when Isaac is born, things come to a head again. And there's an enmity between Isaac and Ishmael and Hagar and Sarah. And again, Hagar is forced to flee into the desert. And she despairs that I'm going to die out here. She puts Ishmael underneath a bush because she can't bear to watch him die. And again, God sends an angel to her. Except this time, he doesn't tell her to go back. This time, he provides for her right there in the desert. He points her to a spring, and Hagar raises Ishmael in the desert. He becomes an archer, becomes strong, and eventually he settles down near the land of Egypt. And Ishmael has 12 sons who become 12 tribes, almost an exact parallel of Isaac's story. And if you fast forward all the way to the end, the last we see of Ishmael is the moment when Abraham dies. And in that moment, you have this one little line. Abram lived 175 years. So this is, over 75 years later. Abram breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and he's gathered to his people. And his sons, plural, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in their memory, and the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. Both his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, side by side, children of the promise, paying homage to their dad. With all of his faults and failures, that's the way the story wraps itself up. But if you go back to that moment, when Hagar has just run away and she's by the spring and she doesn't know where she's going to go, no one can see the end of the story. Not Sarah, not Abraham, certainly not Hagar. They can't see this future that God is writing. The only one who can see it is God himself. And what I want you to see is that God does three essential things in this moment with Hagar. The first thing is God sees. Hagar says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." God can see present, past, future. God can see my heart, my dreams, my desires. And think about this. Hagar this whole time has felt invisible. Her hopes, her dreams are unseen, and yet she knows in that moment, God sees me. So God sees. The second thing God does is God hears. He says to Hagar, "You are pregnant, and I want you to name your son Ishmael," which means literally, God hears, for the Lord has heard of your misery. So every time that she speaks to her son, if he gets in trouble, Ishmael, or when she calls him, Ishmael, come here. Every time she says that word, she is reminded, God hears. That her cries have never been outside of God's hearing. And lastly, God sees, God hears, and God mends and extends the promise. He mends the broken fellowship between Hagar and Sarah and Abraham. He mends what is broken there, but he even extends the promise, because up to this point, Hagar has not been part of God's promise to Abraham. She's been separate, and yet in that moment, God takes an outsider, a slave, a maidservant, and extends the promise to her and to her progeny. To me, this is so important to think that God doesn't just fix what's broken, but God takes that moment to extend his grace to those who have never known it, so that they can know they're part of his love and care too. Remember, it's not the moment, it's the story, and it's the promise that holds us even in our darkest moments that keeps the story moving forward. I used this quote last week from Walter Brueggemann. It says, "It is the oath and not the circumstance, the promise and not just where we find ourselves in the moment, that tells us this true story of reality." And I would just amend that slightly for our story today to say, it is the promise and not the moment that tells the full story of our lives. It's God's promise and not just the moment that tells us who we are and where we are going. And I can go to the New Testament and use an example from there, the story of Jesus' life. If you were to freeze frame at the lowest moment of that story, what would you choose? Probably Good Friday, right? The moment when Jesus, God's Son, is nailed to a cross. The moment when God's Son cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's the low moment, right? And in that moment, if you pause right there, what do you see? Mary is brokenhearted. Peter is ashamed. The disciples are cowards. The Son of God is defeated, and the devil is triumphant. But we know that's not the end of the story. That just a few days later, God raises Jesus from the dead, and then he turns the world upside down. But because we know the end of the story, because we know God's promise holds true, it takes us back to that moment, and we see even that darkest of moments in a different light. Because what do we see? Even in that moment, God sees, God hears, God mends and extends. God sees the sin of the world. God hears the groaning of creation. God hears the cries of his beloved Son. But even in that moment, what is he doing? He's mending the broken covenant of Israel through the broken body of his Son. He's extending that covenant to include all nations and all peoples so that through Jesus we might be saved as well. It's the promise, not the moment, that tells the story. And so I just want to ask you, what moment are you in right now? In your life, what moment are you in? Are you feeling distant from God right now in this moment? Maybe you're like Hagar and you feel alone and invisible, outcast and unseen. Maybe you're like Abraham and Sarah. You've broken a promise, or you're not your best version of yourself in this moment. That's okay. Maybe it's when you look around at the world and you see the moment we're in historically as a country, and you think, it's never going to get better, or it's so dark right now. I just encourage you and challenge you to remember that the promise tells the true story, and the moment doesn't tell the whole story. We have to trust in God's promise, the promise we've received through Abraham, the promise which has been extended and mended through the sacrifice of his Son, Christ Jesus. Through him, we know that we belong to God, and that God even now is working a work of redemption in our world and in our lives. And what will tell the story of our lives is the promise of God being held by his Son in the highs and lows of our journey. I want to close by just reflecting on the journey we've been on as a church. When I made the announcement in March that we were suspending services, that was a pretty low moment. It was a moment that I thought I would never have as a pastor, right? I never thought as a pastor I would close the church building doors, and yet, as Seth said, that wasn't the closing of the church, it was the closing of a building. At the time, I said, this will be 2-3 weeks. We'll reopen Palm Sunday and Easter. I was so naive, hopelessly optimistic. We didn't know then the journey we would be on. And let's be honest, we are still on this journey. And yet God has shown us already that he can be trusted in the highs and lows, and we can continue to trust that God will keep on working to tell a full story. And in the moment, we may not be able to see the end of the story yet, but we can trust in the God who has seen the end of the story and whose promise holds us. I said it's the promise, not the moment, that tells the story, but maybe that's not even the right way to put it. Because I think in every moment, both the highs and the lows, in every moment, the promise of God holds us. And so every moment tells the story, because I think that's what the story is ultimately about. Check this out.
You have created our hearts for unbroken fellowship. Yet the constraints of time and place and the stuttering rhythms of life will at times be broken or incomplete.
I reached the difficult decision that beginning this Sunday, March 15th, we will suspend Sunday morning services here at ZUMC and continuing for the next 2 Sundays beyond that as well.
And so we find ourselves in this season, bearing the sorrow of our separation from one another. But Even in our goodbyes, there is a blessing. For the sorrow of parting is a measure of the depth of the bond we have come to share in Christ. Thank you, O God, that we do not walk this road alone.
The Spirit is with us as His church, even when we're scattered to the four corners of the earth.
O Lord, make us ever mindful of one another unto the end, that we would labor in days to come as those who would tend and encourage the stories of those around us, by prayer and friendship and thoughtfulness and conversation, affirming and sharpening and amplifying one another's good works unto the end, that your body would be built up, and that your kingdom would be more fully realized in this world. Thank you, O God, for the mercy and the beauty lived out in the words and acts of these your people, extended one toward another. It is not accident that we were born in the same age and that our stories have twined in this time and in this place. Let us journey from here together as vessels of God's mercy and as stewards of that wild and wondrous beauty that flows from the heart and mind of our Creator.
We are so excited to be opening our church doors in just a few weeks on the morning of July 12th. Know that no matter where you choose to worship, whether it's here at the church or in your home, you are a valued part of our faith community, and we pray for God's peace and blessings and grace to be with you all.
O Spirit of God, be present in our journeys. Be present in our days to come. Be present in our works and in our words and in our hearts. Be present in the bonds of our community, Lord Christ. Be ever at work among us and through us.